I have drawn the king's guard for 31 years, and in all that time only one man ever made me set my pencil down. His name was Dorian Prosk. He did it at 11 minutes past 11 on a gray Tuesday in the spring, in front of 200 strangers and a camera worth more than my house, and he did it so cheerfully that half the forecourt was laughing before anyone understood what they were laughing at. My name is Hollis Wren. I am 61 years old. I have a licensed pitch at the north gate of the palace, 3rd stone from the lamp post, the one the rain finds first, and I draw portraits for 4 crowns apiece. Tourists mostly, grandmothers who want to be flattered, young men who want to be handsome. And behind them always the reason they came. The sentries on the gate, red wool and black bearskin, rifles at their shoulders, standing the kind of still that most people have never seen a living body manage. I know that stillness better than anyone alive who is not wearing it. I have drawn it in the rain, in the snow, in the white summer light that bleaches the brass and makes the guardsmen's faces run with sweat they are not permitted to wipe. I have 400 and some sketches of the man on the left-hand box. His name is Emeric Dane, 3rd Company of the King's Foot Guards, and on the morning Dorian Prosk arrived, he had been standing his post for 11 years. That day I was sketching the railings, which is what I do when the crowd is thin. Iron is honest, it does not fidget. Then a van the color of a wedding cake pulled up on the king's approach, and out of it came 6 young people with equipment cases, and out of the front seat came Prosk. You would have known him at once. Some men enter a public square the way weather enters a valley. He was perhaps 40, tall, in an expensive coat cut to look careless, and he was already talking not to any of us, but to a lens, which one of his people was holding at arm's length and walking backwards to keep steady. Which is the single most famous non-moving object in the world, he was saying. Not a statue, not a monument, a man who has agreed for money to stop being a man for 2 hours at a stretch. His crew set up in 90 seconds. I have watched film companies take a morning to do less. Tripods, a long lens, a boom, a little gray box that blinked, and a young fellow with a headset who kept looking at the guardsmen the way you look at a dog you have been told is friendly. Prosk walked the line of the railings. He looked up at the palace face, at the standard, at the sentry boxes, and he wore an expression I have seen on a great many faces and have learned to distrust, the look of a man taking an inventory of things that belong to other people. Then he found Dane and he stopped. Understand what he was looking at. Dane stood with his heels together and his rifle at his right shoulder and his eyes fixed on a point above the heads of the crowd, on nothing, on a spot he had been staring at for a decade. His chin strap sat below his lip. His gloves were white to a degree that ordinary laundry cannot achieve. There were 3 metal ribbons on his breast, and the brass of his buttons had been worked to the color of a fresh coin. He was, in every visible respect, a thing rather than a person, and that is the trick of it, and that is the cost of it, and almost nobody in that square had ever once thought about the second part. "Hello," Prosk said to him, gently, the way you speak to something in a zoo. Dane looked at nothing. "Hello," Prosk said again and turned to his lens and grinned and shrugged. He's shy. That got the first laugh, not a cruel one, a ripple. He walked in a slow circle around the sentry's ground, not over the line, mind. He never once put a boot where he could have been touched for it, not that first day, and he began to narrate. He had the voice for it. Warm, easy, a friend telling you a story in a bar. "They call it discipline," he said. "I want you to think about what it actually is. This gentleman is paid a wage that would embarrass you. He has been ordered to stand here and be photographed by strangers, and the one thing he is not allowed to do is have a reaction. Not a word, not a smile, not a wince. Now," and here he leaned in a little confidingly to the camera, "is that discipline? Or is that just a very expensive puppet with the strings out of shot?" I put my pencil down. I want to be accurate because there was an inquiry afterwards and I have had to be accurate about it several times under oath. He did not shout. He did not swear. He was not, in the way the word is usually meant, aggressive. He was funny. That was the whole of his weapon, and it was a better weapon than a fist, because a fist would have finished it in 4 seconds and a joke can go on for 3 days. He fell in beside Dane's box, an arm's length clear, and he assumed the stance. He did it well. That was the thing nobody expected. He was an athletic man, and he had clearly studied the footage. He got the heels, the shoulders, the dead level of the chin. He stood there beside the sentry, and he held it 5 seconds, 10, and his crew filmed both of them in profile. And for a moment the square was quiet with a kind of surprised attention. Then his knee buckled, deliberately. His arm dropped. His head lolled, and he made a small mechanical noise, a asterisk worklick asterisk, like something running out of spring, and he tottered a half step and froze at a broken angle with his eyes crossed. The laugh that went up then was the real one. It came out of 200 people at once, and it went off the palace stone and came back at us, and it hurt to hear, and I have never in my life so badly wanted a laugh to stop. "The wind-up man," Prosk announced, straightening, delighted with himself. "Ladies and gentlemen, the famous wind-up man of the palace. Somebody has forgotten to turn his key." And Dane stood. That is the part I could never get onto paper, not in 400 sketches, and I have tried. It is not an absence. People think it is an absence, that he had gone somewhere behind his own eyes, that he was thinking about his supper, that the stillness was a kind of sleep. It is the opposite. It is the most tremendously occupied thing you will ever see a man do. Everything in him was pulling, and everything in him was held. And if you knew how to look, you could see the whole war of it in the muscle at the corner of his jaw, and nowhere else in his entire body. I knew how to look. I had been drawing that jaw for 11 years. I should tell you what a sentry may actually do, because everyone in that square thought they knew, and not one of them did, and it matters for everything that came after. He may stand. He may march his beat when the beat is ordered, 10 paces out, turn, 10 paces back, at a pace laid down before anyone alive was born. He may come to attention. He may, if a person crowds his ground or blocks his beat, stamp his boot, which is a sound that stops most people's hearts, and he may say the words he is permitted to say, which are few and old and always the same. He may present arms to those entitled to it. In the last extremity, if the palace or the person of the royal family or the public are in danger, he may act, and act hard, and the standing orders trust him to know when. That is all. He may not answer a taunt. He may not defend his mother's name. He may not tell you that the medal you are calling a costume prop was pinned to him on a wet morning by a man who has since died. He may not laugh, and he may not weep, and he may not, this is the one that nobody believes until they see it, he may not brush a wasp off his cheek in August. The public sees the wall and thinks the wall is easy because it is a wall. Nobody wonders what it costs a man to be masonry. Prosk did his bit for 20 minutes, and he was clever enough to vary it. He mimed winding a key in Dane's back without touching him. He pretended to conduct him like an orchestra. He stood on tiptoe and looked into Dane's eyes from 6 inches and reported to his audience in a hushed voice that there was nobody home. The crowd loved him. It is easy afterwards to pretend that decent people were appalled from the first minute, and they were not. They were on holiday. They had come to see a man who does not move, and here was a man making a comedy of him, and it is a very small step from look at the marvel asterisk to look at the fool, and it takes one confident person to walk you across it. At 11:45, Prosk got out the coins. He had a leather satchel, and it was heavy, and when he opened it, there was that particular deep chuckle of metal that money makes and nothing else does. He took out a handful and held them up to the light for the camera to see. They were tokens, his own. He had them struck by the 1,000, and he threw them to the people who followed him, and I have one in a drawer in my flat to this day, so I can tell you exactly what it looked like. Brass, the size of a large coin, a little heavier than it wanted to be, with a lion's head on one face, not our lion, an invented one, a swaggering thing with its tongue out and on the reverse in raised capitals, the word Prosk, and below it smaller, take the shot. He turned to the crowd with a handful of them, and he said the line that finished him, eventually, in a courtroom 11 weeks later, though of course none of us knew that yet. "It's traditional," he said, "to tip the statue." And he threw them. Not hard, the first ones. He tossed them underhand at Dane's boots so that they rang on the cobbles and skittered, and people laughed, and then people did worse than laugh, because 2 or 3 of them came forward with coins of their own, real ones, out of their pockets, and began to throw them too, and a boy of about 19 shied one off the door of the sentry box, and the crack of it went up the whole face of the palace. Dane stood. Prosk was watching him with a face I did not understand at first and understood perfectly by that evening. He was not enjoying it anymore. He was working. He was a man in a workshop with a piece of metal in a vise, testing where the flaw was, and he had noticed what I had noticed, which is that the man in the vise was not going to crack from being laughed at. So he changed his throw. He took a token and he weighed it, and he threw it overarm and flat and fast, and it went past Dane's ear close enough to stir the fur of the bearskin and struck the stone behind him, and Prosk said, "Oh, sorry, asterisk," to the camera, in the voice of a man who is not. The next one hit. It caught Dane on the cheekbone, an inch below the eye, above the line of the chin strap. It made a sound. I was 8 feet away and I heard it, a small, wrong, personal sound, the sound of brass finding bone, and the token dropped and rolled and came to rest, and it stopped rolling against my shoe. He did not move. He did not move. There was a red mark coming up on his cheek like a thumbprint pressed into wax, and his eyes were on the same nothing they had been on all morning, and the only thing in the world that changed was the muscle at the corner of his jaw, which stood out like a cord, and then, deliberately, went slack. Somebody in the crowd said, "That's not," and did not finish. I bent down and I picked up the token. That was the second thing I did that day that I have had to explain under oath. I picked it up and I turned it over and the lion looked at me with its stupid tongue out, and I put it in my coat pocket, and then I sat back on my stool and I turned to a clean page and I wrote the date at the top, and the time, and I drew what I had just seen. I have never drawn anything faster or worse. It is a terrible sketch. It is in a glass case now. The constable came at about 12:10. Palace Precinct, a decent man called Perrin whom I have known for years, and he had a word with Prosk, and I watched Prosk take that word the way a lawyer takes a fee, leaning in, nodding, agreeing, delighted to be spoken to. I could not hear all of it. I heard the end of it, because Prosk raised his voice for the end of it since the camera was still running. "Officer," he said, "I have hurt nobody, I have touched nobody, I have crossed no line, and every single second of this is recorded by me at very high resolution for the benefit of 11 million people. Would you like to be in it?" Perrin's jaw worked. He told Prosk to move his van. That was the extent of what he could do, and both of them knew it, and one of them was pleased. The crew packed up at 1. The crowd drifted. The tokens lay in the gutter and along the cobbles, dozens of them, and the sweepers would come for them at 4. And Prosk, hoisting his coat, called out to the sentry box, cheerfully, without malice, which was somehow the worst of it, the words that turned all of this from a bad morning into the thing it became. "Same time tomorrow, wind-up man," he said. "Bring your key. I'm bringing something that flies." Then he looked up at the sky above the palace, and he smiled at it like a man who has found an unlocked door. I stayed after he had gone. I did that sometimes when the light was good, and that day I did it because I did not want to leave. At 2, the relief came up, 4 men and a sergeant, boots on stone, the changeover done with the same brisk indifference to spectators it has always had. Dane came off the box. He did not touch his face. He did not look at the gutter where his tips lay. He wheeled and marched away under the arch with the mark on his cheekbone going purple, and the last thing I saw of him that day was the back of the bearskin, and it told me nothing because it never does. The sergeant stayed a moment. Osric Hale, Sergeant Major, a slab of a man with a voice like a door closing. He looked at the coins on the cobbles for a long moment. Then he looked at me. "You saw it, Mr. Wren." "I saw it." "Did you draw it?" "I drew it." "Then keep the page," he said, and went in. I have thought about that a great deal. He did not ask me to keep the page for the palace, or for a lawyer, or for a court. He asked me to keep it because it was true, and there was going to be a great deal of untruth, and old soldiers can smell that coming the way farmers smell rain. That night I sat in my kitchen with the token on the table, and I looked up the man's channel. 11 million was not a boast. It was, if anything, modest. Dorian Prosk had made himself rich by going to other people's countries, finding the thing they were solemn about, and standing next to it being funny. It was not stupid work. He had an unerring instinct for the exact place where a people keep the thing they will not joke about. He went there, and he joked about it, and the ones who were angry were the best advertisement he had. That was the business. He did not want Dane to be ridiculous. He wanted Dane to break on camera, in a way the whole world could feel sorry about afterwards, and it did not matter to him at all whether the world laughed or wept as long as the world was watching him do it. I closed the machine and I went to bed, and I did not sleep. He came back at 10 the next morning, and he brought a crowd with him, because he had told them to come. I had never seen the North Gate like that. 400 people, maybe 5. Young ones mostly. They had the tokens. They had bought the tokens. You could hear them chinking in pockets all down the railings. There were 3 of Prosk's people on ladders with cameras, and a woman with a clipboard organizing a queue, an actual queue, and taped to the railing at the head of it was a card that said, in letters big enough to read from my pitch, 500 crowns to the first person who makes him smile. Rules: do not touch, do not cross, do not break the law. Be funny. That is a very clever piece of paper. I want you to look at it for a moment. Every word of it is a shield. He was not inciting an assault. He had written down, on the railings of the palace in front of a constable, that nobody was to touch and nobody was to cross and nobody was to break the law. He had made himself, on the record, the most responsible man in the square. And then he had put 500 crowns on the head of another man's soul. They came at Dane all morning. A girl played a bugle badly. A man in a bearskin costume, an actual costume, plush, with a comic strap, marched up and down the beat aping the pace, and the crowd screamed, and behind him, 4 feet away, the real thing marched his 10 paces out and turned and marched his 10 paces back with the mark on his cheek gone yellow-green at the edges. And then somebody had found, God knows how, in a night, the sort of thing that gets found, and shouted it. That guardsman Emeric Dane had a brother, and that the brother had died, and there followed a joke about it that I will not write down and that I heard, and that Dane heard, and that 400 people laughed at. He marched his 10 paces out, he turned, he marched his 10 paces back. Constable Perrin was there, and he had 2 more constables with him, and there was nothing on earth they could do. Nobody touched, nobody crossed. It was a public square on a public street, and the crowd had a right to be there, and the law does not have a word for what was happening, and Prosk knew that better than any of us, because he had made a fortune out of knowing exactly where the law's fingertips end. At noon I saw a young man from Prosk's crew, standing apart from the rest, with the sound boom trailing from his hand, and his face the color of the stone. He was maybe 23, curly hair, a cheap coat, an expensive headset. He kept looking at Dane and then away. He had been the one walking backwards with the lens on the first day, and he had laughed then, and he was not laughing now. He came over to my pitch, I think because it was the only place in that square where a person could stand with his back to what was happening. "You're the artist," he said. "I'm the artist." He looked at the boards. I had them out on the easel, the guards, the horses, the gate in the snow. How much for one? 4 crowns. He gave me 10 and would not take the change and did not take a picture. He stood there holding it, a small drawing of the north gate in a January fog, and he said to the drawing, not to me. He said it's not a person. He says that a lot. He says on this square the only thing that isn't content is the king, and the king isn't here. What's your name, son? Ivo. He glanced back over his shoulder at the noise. I do the sound. I've done the sound for 2 years. And Ivo did not answer that. He walked away with my drawing held flat against his chest like a man carrying something out of a fire, and I did not speak to him again for 11 days, and when I did it changed everything. Now I have to tell you the thing about Emeric Dane that I had no right to tell and told anyway, in a room with a major and a stenographer and a table between us, because there came a point where the truth was worth more than his privacy. It happened 9 years before at the South Gate, when he was a young man with 2 years' service and a stripe he was proud of. There was a fellow who came for a fortnight. Not a rich man, not a famous one, just a man with a grievance and a phone, who had discovered that if you stand in front of a sentry and say the foulest thing you can invent, the sentry cannot answer, and that this makes for a very popular sort of film. He worked out what Dane's soft place was. It took him 4 days. Dane's father had been a trooper of the household cavalry for 22 years and had died badly and slowly of something he had picked up in a place he was never permitted to name. And there is always a way to find these things, and the man found it, and he stood at the railing at the South Gate for 8 days running, and told a young guardsman in loving detail what his father had been. On the 9th day, Emeric Dane spoke. 7 words. I know them because everyone in the regiment knows them, and because they are on the internet still, and you can find them in about 4 seconds if you are the kind of person who wants to. He was worth 10,000 of you. That is all he said. He did not move. He did not raise the rifle. He said 7 true words in a flat voice with his eyes forward, and it was filmed, and it went round the world in a day, and the man who had spent 9 days engineering it made more money out of those 7 words than he had made in his life. And the young guardsman who said them lost his stripe and stood before a board and was sent to a depot for 11 months and came back a different man. Not bitter, that is what I want to be clear about. Emeric Dane did not come back bitter, which is what you would expect and what would have been easier. He came back silent, in a way that went all the way down. He told me about it once 4 years ago in the winter, when I had been at my pitch too long and my hands had gone, and he found me at the end of a shift trying to get my fingers around a cup of tea and could not, and he sat down on the wall beside me, off duty in a plain coat, and helped me, and then stayed. Do you know what I learned, Mr. Wren? I said I did not. I learned that he did not want me to be angry, Dane said. He wanted a frame, 1 second of film where the wall has a face. That's the whole of it. And I gave it to him, and I gave him everything he had, and he lives well on it to this day. He got up. He handed me back my cup, and he said the thing I have thought about nearly every day since. So I'm not going to give anyone a frame again. That's all it is. It isn't strength. It's just that I know what it's for now. 400 people threw their voices at him that Wednesday, and a boy shouted a joke about his dead brother, and 500 crowns lay on the table for whoever could reach the wall, and I sat at my pitch with a token in my pocket and a page in my book, and I understood, better than anyone in that square, that they were never going to get it. But I also understood something that frightened me, and I sat with it all afternoon and could not put it down. Prosk understood it too. He had watched the whole morning with a small, thoughtful, entirely unamused expression, and at 3 o'clock, when the crowd was tiring and the bounty was unclaimed and the joke had gone soft in everybody's mouth, I saw him take his phone out and step away from his people and make a call, and I watched his face while he made it. He was not disappointed, he was recalculating. A man who wants a laugh gives up when the laugh dies. A man who wants an asterisk reaction only changes the size of what he throws. He rang off and he looked up, not at Dane. Up, past the bearskin, past the railing, past the standard on its pole, into the empty gray air above the palace roof, where nothing is permitted to fly. And I got up off my stool, and I walked over to Constable Perrin, and I said, "He's going to put something in the sky." Perrin looked at me for a long moment. "Mr. Wren," he said tiredly, "half this square is going to put something in the sky. They're called phones." Not a phone. He knew. I could see that he knew. He had been on this precinct 9 years, and he had the same crawling feeling I did, and he had exactly as much power to act on a feeling as I had, which was none. "If it flies," he said, "then it's a matter for the Crown Aviation Office and the Palace Security Officer, and it is out of my hands and into much bigger ones. And Mr. Wren," he lowered his voice, "I would very much like it to fly." I said I did not understand. "He spent 2 days doing everything a man can do that I cannot arrest him for," said Perrin. "He's better at that than anyone I've ever met, and there is nothing at all that I can do to him." He put his hat straight. "But if he flies something over that roof," he said, "he stops being clever, because that isn't a matter of taste. That's the one place on this island where the law has no sense of humor whatsoever." He did not come on the Thursday. That was the cleverest thing he did in the whole business, and it very nearly worked, and I want to set out what it did to the square, because it explains why nobody stopped him on the Friday. For one whole day the North Gate was ordinary. The tourists came and photographed and went. The sweepers had taken the tokens. A schoolmistress brought a line of pupils and told them in a carrying voice that the guards were not permitted to speak, and one of them waved anyway, and Guardsman Dane looked at nothing, and it was all exactly as it has been for 200 years. And by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, everybody had decided that it was over. That is how it works. A thing is unbearable for 2 days and then it stops for 1, and the human animal, which is built for weather and not for men, concludes that the storm has passed. Perrin stood down his extra constables. Even I, with a token in my coat pocket and the sound of it hitting bone still in my ears, packed up on Thursday evening and thought, well, he's bored of us asterisk. He was not bored of us, he was building an audience. I saw it later, all of it, in the way you see a thing when it is being read out in a courtroom by a woman in a black gown at 10:30 in the morning. On the Thursday, while the North Gate went quietly about its day, Dorian Prosk published a 9-minute film called Asterisk the Man Who Isn't There Asterisk, and it was watched before the Friday morning 4 million times. It was very well made. I will say that for him, and I will say it once. It had the mimicry and the wind-up bit and the crowd's laugh, and then it turned and got serious and got asterisk sad asterisk, and Prosk sat in a hotel window at dusk with the city behind him and talked, quietly, about how a nation could take a young man and stand him on a stone for 11 years and forbid him to be human, and how that was the real cruelty here, and how he intended tomorrow to prove it. "Tomorrow," he said to 4 million people, "we're going to get closer to him than anyone has ever got, because I don't think there's nothing in there. I think there's a man in there, and I think he deserves to be seen asterisk." He held up his hands, and between them, small and gray and folded, was the machine. "Friday," he said, 11 o'clock. "Come and watch him be a person." You see what he had done. He had made himself the hero of it. Every single thing he was going to do on Friday he had already explained as an act of compassion, and 4 million people had already agreed. And the coins were not in the film at all. Not one frame of them. Not the throw, not the sound of brass on bone, not the mark that was still on Emeric Dane's face. He cut it out. He had it, and he cut it out, and he kept it, because Dorian Prosk never in his life threw away a piece of film. That is the fact on which the whole of the rest of this turns, and he did not know it, and neither did I. Friday was bright. First proper light of the spring, the stone gone the color of butter, and the crowd began arriving before 9. By 11 there were 1,000 people on the king's approach. The palace had put out extra barriers overnight, a low steel line, 4 feet back from the railings, and there were 8 constables and a security officer in a suit with an earpiece and a very still way of standing, and Sergeant Major Hale had come out twice to look at the sky and go back in again. And it was a state day. That is what nobody in the crowd understood, and what everybody in the palace was thinking about from the moment they woke. At noon, Princess Adela was to leave the North Gate in an open carriage with the mounted escort, and go the length of the king's approach, and open the spring subscription of the old company's fund, which is the veterans' fund of this realm, and has been for 140 years, and which pays for the wheelchair ramps and the winter coal, and the small quiet pensions of men who came home from places the newspapers have forgotten. She had done it every spring for 19 years. She rode in the open carriage because she would not do it any other way. There would be 16 horses of the escort and 11 old men on the steps in their berets, and the whole thing would take 40 minutes, and it was the single fixed point of Emeric Dane's year, because his father had been of the escort, and because the fund had paid for the bed his father died in. Prosk arrived at 11:10, the van, the crew, the ladders, and the case. It was a hard black case, and he opened it on the bonnet like a man laying out surgical instruments, and out of it came the drone. It was not a toy. It weighed a little over 2 kilograms, it had 8 rotors, it carried a stabilized camera on a gimbal beneath it, and it cost more than I earned in 3 years. And it was, in that square on that day, as illegal as a loaded gun. Constable Perrin walked straight at him. I have never seen a man cover ground so fast without running. "Mr. Prosk, you will not fly that." "Officer," Prosk did not even look up, he was seating the battery. "Permit." He held up a piece of paper without looking at it, and the woman with the clipboard was already there with a second copy, and a third, and one of them went into Perrin's hand. I read it later. It was, and I choose the word carefully, genuine. It was a film unit permit, issued by the city licensing office 3 weeks earlier, for aerial photography of * public thoroughfares and streetscapes within the borough *. It had a stamp and a number and the signature of a clerk who, when the aviation office finally telephoned her, burst into tears. It did not permit, it could not permit, no clerk in that office had the power on this earth to permit flight in the restricted air above the palace. That air is written into an instrument of state. A borough clerk can no more grant you leave to fly there than she can grant you leave to sit on the throne. But it was a real paper, with a real stamp, and a police constable standing in a square with 1,000 people watching him and 4 cameras on his face, had about 9 seconds to decide whether the piece of paper in his hand was good, and if he was wrong, it was his career. Perrin looked at it. His jaw worked. I could see him doing the arithmetic of his own ruin. "This isn't valid over the palace," he said. "It's valid over the street," said Prosk pleasantly. "I'll be flying over the street. Won't I, Ivo? Will be over the street." Ivo at the tripod said nothing at all. "I want the palace security officer," Perrin said, and turned to find him, and that was the 9 seconds, and that was the whole thing. Because Dorian Prosk put the drone on the cobbles and stepped back, and it lifted. I will not pretend it was not extraordinary. The crowd made a sound I have never heard a crowd make, a kind of indrawn *O with a laugh at the bottom of it, as the thing came off the stone with a rising whine and hung at head height, and turned slowly on its own axis, and looked at us with its one glass eye. Then it climbed. It went up to 20 feet, 30, and slid sideways along the line of the railings, and the crowd's heads went with it, and there was a screen on the tripod now where the picture was coming down, and it was showing all of us the top of our own heads, and people were waving. and then it turned and it went for the box. He flew it in from the front, slow, level with the bearskin, and he brought it to a stop 4 feet from Emeric Dane's face. I was 8 feet away and I could hear it. That is the detail I gave the board and the detail I gave the court, because it is the one that matters. At 4 feet, that machine is not quiet. It is a saw. It is a hard, close, cycling scream of 8 blades, and the wash of it moved the fur of the bearskin and flattened the ribbon on his breast and made his eyes water, and it filled his whole world, and he could not move, and he could not look away, and he could not raise a hand. Prosk had the controller in both hands and his face was lit from below by the screen, and he was smiling. "There," he said, "now we can *C**U." He took it in to 3 feet, then 2. The camera on the gimbal turned and tilted and came in until, on the tripod screen, there was nothing in the world but Guardsman Emeric Dane's face, filling the frame in extraordinary detail, every pore of it, the yellow bruise on the cheekbone, the wet in the corners of the eyes, the chin strap cutting the lip, the pulse going in his throat like something trapped under the skin. 11 million people that night would look at that face. He held it there for 2 minutes and 40 seconds. I know that because the flight log says so, and the flight log was written by the machine itself, and the machine did not care whose side it was on. At 2 minutes and 10, the crowd stopped laughing. I have gone over that in my mind many times and I cannot tell you why precisely, except that there is a point at which a joke becomes a thing being done to a man, and 1,000 people all felt it arrive at once, and a woman near me said, quite loudly, "Oh, that's no. Prosk did not feel it arrive. That was his flaw, and it was the only one he had, and it was enough. He was inside the screen. He was watching that face like a man watching a lock. "Come on," he said, and he was not performing now. His voice had gone flat and small, and I do not think he knew he had said it out loud. "Come on, blink, give me something. Give me one thing." And Emeric Dane, with a 2-kilogram machine screaming at arm's length from his eyes, did the only thing his orders permitted him to do, which was nothing, and which was everything. At 2 minutes 40, a bell rang inside the palace. It was the 1:15. The drone hung where it was, and Prosk's head came up off the screen, and behind the great gates there began the sound that every person at that gate had come to hear at some point in their lives, and that almost none of them recognized until it was on top of them. The ring and clatter of 16 shod horses coming up the cobbles of the inner yard in column, at the walk. The escort was coming out, the gates were opening. And Dorian Prosk looked at the screen, and looked at the gates, and I saw the thought land in his face with the clarity of a struck match. He did not fly it away. He flew it up. The gates of the North Gate are 18 feet of gilded iron, and they take a slow half-minute to swing. And in that half-minute, the drone went from 4 feet off Emeric Dane's face to 60 feet over the forecourt, and turned and stopped, and hung above the arch looking down into the yard. Over the palace, over the roof, over the standard. I heard Constable Perrin say a word I had never heard him say, and I heard the security officer in the suit talking fast and low into his cuff, and I heard, from somewhere behind the wall, a whistle blow twice. And then the escort came out. They came in column of 2s, 16 troopers, black horses and grays, the breastplates going like water in that first hard spring sun. And the crowd roared, because a crowd always roars. And behind them the carriage came through the arch with the 2 bays in the traces and the coachman up, and the Princess Adela sitting straight-backed and bare-headed with her hands in her lap. She was 54 years old that spring. She had ridden that road in the rain, in sleet, in the year her mother died, and once, famously, with a broken wrist she had not mentioned to anybody until the following week. She did not wave much. She had a way of looking at the old men on the steps that was worth more than waving. The column turned onto the approach. The lead pair came level with the sentry boxes. Emeric Dane brought his rifle from the shoulder and presented arms, the crash of the drill going off like a gunshot, the salute of a sentry to the blood of the house. And Princess Adela inclined her head to him, as she had every spring for 19 years. And Dorian Prosk brought the drone down out of the sky on top of them. I do not believe, I have never believed, and I said so on oath, that he intended to hurt anybody. It is not, in the end, a defense. He intended to get the shot. He wanted the machine low over the column with the breastplates and the plumes and the carriage in one falling sweep. And he wanted it close because close is what 11 million people pay for. And he brought it down in a long dropping arc from 60 feet to 12, at speed, straight down the line of horses from the rear. Now, 16 horses of the mounted escort are the best schooled animals in this realm. They are trained against drums, against bands, against gunfire, against 1,000 people screaming at them from 6 feet. They can be ridden through a wall of noise and not shift a hoof. They are not trained against a 2-kilogram machine, with 8 blades screaming down onto their heads from behind, out of the sun, where no horse alive can see it coming. The gray mare went first. She was the near-side leader of the second file, Kestrel, 16 hands, 11 years old, ridden that morning by Trooper Inez Calder, who is not much over 5 feet and who I had drawn a dozen times and always found difficult, because of the way she held her chin. The drone came over Kestrel's croup at 9 feet, and the noise arrived on top of her before the shadow did, and she went up. Straight up, both forelegs off the ground, then higher, and I saw daylight under her, and I saw Trooper Calder go back with her, hard, and I saw the reins run through one glove, and I saw the horse behind her, a black gelding, throw his head and swing across the road, and the file broke. 16 horses. 16 horses coming apart on a cobbled street, with 1,000 people packed against a 4-foot barrier, and an open carriage 40 feet behind them with a woman sitting in it. The crowd screamed and did what a crowd always does, which is the worst possible thing. It surged. It came off the railings and forward against the steel barriers to see, and the barrier at the corner, I watched the whole of it. The barrier at the corner went over. It just went. 4 sections of it, flat on the cobbles, and 30 or 40 people spilled through the gap into the road with the horses coming apart in front of them, and a woman went down on her knees, and a man fell over her. And the drone came round for another pass. Emeric Dane moved. I have had 11 years to learn the vocabulary of that man's stillness, and I had never once seen what was underneath it, and what was underneath it was very fast. He did not run at Prosk. That is the thing. That is the whole of the man in 1 second, and it is the thing that saved him afterwards, and it is the thing I have never been able to make anybody outside that square understand. Dorian Prosk was 9 feet away from him with the controller in his hands and his back turned, and a man who had been mocked for 3 days and hit in the face with a brass token and screamed at by a machine for 2 minutes and 40 seconds could have reached him in a stride and a half. He never looked at him. He came off the box and he went for the horse. He crossed the ground between the box and the head of the column in about 4 strides, and the last of them took him into the road under the mare's front feet as she came down, and he got a white glove up and closed it on the near rein below the bit, and he turned her head. You turn a horse's head. That is the whole art of it, and any trooper's son knows it, and Emeric Dane was a trooper's son. You do not pull down. You cannot pull down. A horse weighs 600 kilos and you weigh 80. You take her head and you turn it so that she cannot go up, so that the power in her hindquarters has somewhere to go that is not straight up or straight into the crowd, and you go round with her, and you keep your feet. He kept his feet. Kestrel came round in a hard, tight circle with her eyes showing white and her shoulder against his chest, and he went round with her, 1 glove on the rein and 1 flat on her neck, and he was talking. I could not hear it. Trooper Calder heard it. She said at the inquiry that he was saying the horse's name. He did not know the horse's name. He had watched that column go out every spring of his service, and he had never met the animal in his life. And Inez Calder swore under oath that Guardsman Dane said, "Kestrel, Kestrel, steady, my girl." And I do not know how to explain that except to say that he had been listening to the escort's grooms across a courtyard wall for 11 years, and that a man who is not permitted to speak spends a great deal of his life listening. She came down. She stood blowing, shaking all over, with her head turned into him. And behind them, the black gelding swung out of line, and the second file jammed, and the whole column stopped, and stopped safely because horses follow horses, and the one at the front of the trouble was standing still with a man's hand on her rein. The carriage never got closer than 30 feet. The coachman had it stopped, and the two bays were fighting him, and Princess Adela was on her feet in the open carriage with one hand on the rail, and she was not looking at the horses. She was looking at the crowd through the fallen barrier. There is a photograph of that moment on the front of every newspaper in the realm, and I imagine there always will be. The column broken, the gray mare with her head down and her nose against the red tunic of a guardsman, the fallen barrier, the people in the road, and 40 feet back, standing in an open carriage with her chin up, a woman of 54 with an expression that I can only describe as arithmetic asterisk. She said afterwards that she was counting how many people were down. And then the drone came in again, low, because Dorian Prosk had lost it. He was fighting the thing, stabbing at the controller, his face gone the color of paper. The machine was in the wash of its own turbulence between two walls of stone with 1,000 bodies under it, and it came skidding sideways over the heads of the crowd at 9 feet with people ducking and going down under it, and it clipped the top of the gilded railing with a shriek of metal that I felt in my teeth. Then it cartwheeled over the railing and came down inside. Inside the line, on the gravel of the forecourt, 30 feet in, on crown ground, where no member of the public has set foot without leave for 200 years, where a sentry may act, and act hard, and the standing orders trust him to know when. It lay there in 3 pieces with one rotor still turning, and the little glass eye pointing at the sky. And Dorian Prosk, and I have watched this on 4 separate cameras since, and I still cannot entirely believe it, Dorian Prosk let go of the controller and ran to the railings and began to climb them. He got one foot on the plinth and both hands on the gilded rail, and he hauled himself up and he screamed, at the top of his lungs, in a voice that came out of him high and cracked and utterly stripped of every charming thing he had ever had. "That's MY camera, that's MY property, get MY camera." There was a woman on the cobbles behind him with a bleeding knee, being helped up by a stranger. There was a trooper with her arm around a mare's neck, shaking. There was a broken barrier and a stopped column, and 11 old men in berets standing on the steps of the fund, a quarter mile away in the sun, waiting for a carriage that was never going to arrive. And a man was climbing the railings of the palace, in front of 1,000 people and his own 8 cameras, screaming about his property. Emeric Dane came back to the line with his glove still on Kestrel's rein. He handed the mare up to Trooper Calder without a word. He turned. He walked. I have watched it frame by frame, and he never once broke into a run. He walked to the railing where Prosk was hanging, and he came to a halt, and he stood, and he said the only words he said out loud in the whole of that day. "Stand back from the King's Guard." That is all. 4 constables and the security officer took Dorian Prosk off the railings 11 seconds later, and he was on the cobbles with his hands behind him and his coat torn at the shoulder, and he was still shouting about the camera. And that I thought sitting on my stool with my hands shaking so badly I could not have drawn a straight line to save my life. That is the end of it. That is the finish. 1,000 people saw it. 8 cameras filmed it. I was 61 years old, and I had lived through 2 wars worth of newspapers, and I had somehow, Still not learned that 1,000 witnesses are worth nothing at all against 9 seconds of film in the hands of a man who knows how to cut. Dorian Prosk was released on bail at 4:20 that afternoon. By 6 o'clock the film was up. It was 51 seconds long. It was called This Is What They Did to a Tourist. It began at the barrier. It began, and I mean this, it began asterisk. There was nothing before it with the crowd surging and the barrier going down, so that the first thing you saw was people falling into a road, and it had a sound on it like a heartbeat slowed. Then a cut. A guardsman coming off his post at a run in red with his rifle. Then a cut, and this is the one. This is the 9 seconds that nearly ended Emeric Dane. A wide shot from the ladder camera of a white glove coming out flat and hard and driving into a man's chest, and the man going back and down onto the cobbles. The man was a bystander. He was 52. He was a plumber from the coast. He had come through the fallen barrier into the road with the crowd behind him, and he was 1 pace from walking into the shoulder of a rearing horse, and Emeric Dane had put a hand out and shoved him clear and saved his life. And he said so, later loudly, to anyone who would listen, and by then nobody was listening. 9 seconds, a wall of red wool striking a man in the chest, a man going down. Then the drone footage, Prosk's own, the aerial, cut to 3 seconds so that you saw only the column breaking and never once saw what came down out of the sky at them. And then Prosk's face, in a car at dusk, with a mark on his cheek where the cobbles had taken him, saying quietly with his voice unsteady, "I asked a question about a man, and they arrested me for it, and they will do whatever it takes to make sure you never see what really happened." 51 seconds, 9 million views by midnight. At 6 on Saturday morning, Sergeant Major Osric Hale telephoned a number he was not supposed to have, and told me that Guardsman Emeric Dane had been removed from the North Gate, suspended from public duties, and ordered to appear before a board of inquiry on the following Thursday, on a charge of using unnecessary force against a member of the public. "They've hung him out," Hale said. He sounded like a man reading his own son's name off a list. "The palace can't be seen to sit on it. 9 million people, Mr. Wren." I asked what would happen. "He'll say nothing," said Hale. "That's what will happen. They'll ask him to explain himself and he will stand there and say nothing, because he will not," and the big voice cracked once and came back, "because he will not give them a frame." There is a particular flavor of madness in being one of 1,000 people who saw a thing, and watching the whole world be told the opposite, and finding that your 1,000 does not weigh anything. I went to the newspapers. 2 of them printed me. Local artist disputes account asterisk, 4 column inches on page 9, beside an advertisement for stair lifts. I stood at my own pitch on the Monday and people looked at my sketches of the guardsmen and said, not troubling to lower their voices, "Those are the ones that beat that tourist up." The plumber from the coast, his name was Waldo Fritt, and I would like it written somewhere, went on the wireless and said that the guard had saved his life. He was very clear and very stubborn about it. He was, within a day, a paid actor, a palace stooge, and a liar, in the opinion of about 2 million people who had never met him. That is how it goes now. The truth gets 4 column inches and the lie gets a heartbeat soundtrack. On the Tuesday, Prosk announced that he was suing the Crown for the return of his property and for damages, and gave an interview in a hotel suite in which he wept, briefly and beautifully, and said that he had never in his life been so frightened as when that man came off the box. On the Wednesday, the old company's fund canceled its spring subscription day, because the horses were stood down and the police would not license the route, and because, as the secretary said in a letter I have read, the mood of the public is not, at present, with the veterans. 11 old men in berets had stood on a step in the sun for 2 hours and gone home. And on the Wednesday evening, at 8:10, a young man with curly hair and a cheap coat knocked on the door of my flat. He was holding my drawing. The North Gate in a January fog. He had it in a plastic bag against the rain, and he had, I think, been walking about with it for some hours, because he was wet through. "Mr. Wren," Ivo said. "I do the sound." I put him in a chair and gave him tea, and he could not hold the cup, so I know what that is like, and I waited. "He keeps everything," Ivo said at last. "That's the thing about him. Everybody thinks he's careless. He isn't. He's the least careless man I've ever worked for. He keeps every card, every take, every second of every day cataloged, backed up, 3 copies. Because you never know what's going to be worth something later. He says that. He says it all the time. Never throw away film, Ivo. Film is a bank." He looked up at me. "He cut the coins out," he said. "He didn't delete them." I sat down slowly, opposite him. "There's a master file," Ivo said. "Ground camera A, continuous 4 hours Tuesday. Sound on it, my sound." He's got the whole thing, the wind-up, the tokens, the throw, all of it. He's got the moment it hit his face, and he's got the noise it made, because I recorded that noise, and I have heard it every night for 11 days. He got the cup to his mouth and got it down again. "And Friday," he said, "there's 4 hours of Friday." "Ivo," I said, "listen to me, if you take that out of his office." "I know what it is." He was very steady all of a sudden, in the way that young men sometimes go steady when they have already decided and are only waiting for someone to be a witness to it. "It's theft, or it's whistle-blowing, and I've been told by a solicitor which one it is on Tuesdays, and I'm still not sure. It doesn't matter. I've got it on me." He put his hand in the pocket of that cheap wet coat and brought out a card no bigger than a stamp. "20 minutes before Friday's flight," he said. He was watching the gates on the monitor, and he leaned over to me and he said something. And my boom was live, and it's on the sound clean with his voice on it, and I have listened to it 400 times. "What did he say?" Ivo Bassett looked at the fire and said, "He said, if a horse jumps, we're made." Now I must tell you the other thing, and it is a smaller thing, and it is the funniest thing in this entire miserable business, and it happened without anybody planning it at all. The drone had come down inside the railings. Inside on the gravel. On crown ground, 30 feet in, which means that from the second it touched the forecourt it was in the lawful custody of the palace, and it was taken up by a corporal in gloves and put in a box and signed for and locked in a room, and there it sat. And Dorian Prosk, who was suing for its return, and whose lawyers were extremely eager to establish that this valuable machine was his own dear property unlawfully withheld from him, had written to the palace, twice, formally, on paper with his name at the top. "I hereby assert ownership of the aerial camera unit, serial number as attached, together with all recordings, flight logs, and telemetry data contained therein, which remain at all times my exclusive property, and I demand their immediate return." He signed it. His solicitors signed it. And the Crown, having been told in writing by the man himself that the machine and every byte inside it belonged to Dorian Prosk and had been flown by Dorian Prosk, took the machine out of the box and gave it to the Crown Aviation Office, and the Crown Aviation Office took out its memory card. Not the camera card. Anyone would have thought of the camera card. The asterisk flight recorder asterisk. That machine had been writing down, 4 times a second, without stopping, without editing, without any interest whatsoever in the reputation of anybody. Its altitude, its position, its speed, its rate of descent, and the exact moment when its operator at the controls pushed the stick forward and drove it from 60 feet to 12 in the air above 16 horses. You cannot cut a flight log. There is nothing in it to be sad about, no heartbeat soundtrack you can lay under it, no face in a car at dusk. It is just numbers, and the numbers were written by his own machine, at his own hands, and he had demanded them back in writing with his signature at the bottom. He gave them the weapon. He wrapped it and he posted it, and he paid a solicitor 400 crowns to make sure it arrived. The board of inquiry sat on the Thursday, in a long room with a long table, under a portrait of a king who has been dead for 100 years. Major Delphine Rook presided. She was a small, gray, extremely quiet woman of about 50, and I was told before I went in that she had spent 9 years doing this work and had broken more careers than she had saved, and that she despised, above all things, a man who could not explain himself. I gave my evidence first. I had my books, 31 years of them, and 11 days of them that mattered, every page dated and timed in my own hand as I have done since I was 29, because a drawing without a time on it is a rumor. I put the token on the table. Brass, a lion with its tongue out, PROSK, take the shot. I told them what it had sounded like. Major Rook turned it over with one finger and did not pick it up. Then they had Trooper Inez Calder, who told them about her horse and about the 4 strides, and Waldo Fritt the plumber, who told them, with enormous dignity and a certain amount of bad language which the stenographer took down anyway, exactly what had been about to happen to him when a white glove hit him in the chest. Then they had the Crown Aviation Office, and a dry man in a cardigan who read the flight log out loud in a monotone for 11 minutes, and by the end of it there was not a person in that room who did not know precisely, to the 10th of a second, what Dorian Prosk had done. And then they had Emeric Dane. They brought him in service dress, no bearskin, and he stood at attention at the end of that long table with his hands at his sides and his eyes on the wall above the major's head, and he looked, without the fur and the rifle, about 10 years older and very much smaller, and I found that I could not look at him. Major Rook read the charge, unnecessary force, a member of the public struck. Guardsman Dane, she said, you left your post. Ma'am. Is that a yes? Yes, ma'am. Explain it. And he said nothing. She waited. She was very good at waiting. She let it run for a full half-minute, which in a room like that is a geological age. Then she said, in a voice with no color in it at all, Guardsman, I have in front of me a film that 9 million people have watched, and in that film you strike a civilian. You have not, in 11 days, given one word of account for yourself, not to your sergeant major, not to the press office, not to me. Why? And Emeric Dane, still looking at the wall, said, Because he wants a frame, ma'am. I beg your pardon. He wants 1 second of film where the wall has a face. His voice did not lift or drop. That's all he's ever wanted. He'd have taken anger. He'd have taken tears. He'd take me explaining myself in this room if it got out, because then I'd be a man arguing about himself, and that's the same picture. I gave a man that frame once, ma'am, 9 years ago, and he is still living on it. I'm not going to do it twice. The room was extremely quiet. Major Rook set down her pen. A brass token struck you in the face, she said. You did not report it. You did not name your assailant. Why? Because it didn't strike me, ma'am. It struck you on the cheekbone. It struck the King's Guard, said Dane. The uniform isn't mine. It's lent to me for 2 hours at a time. If a man throws metal at it, that's a matter for the law, and the law has eyes of its own. It isn't mine to be angry about. Rook looked at him for a long moment. And the horse, she said. For the first time, something moved in his face. Ma'am, the mare was going over backwards into the second file, and there was a barrier down and 40 people in the road, and the carriage was 30 feet behind. So I went to her head. You abandoned a sentry's post at the north gate of the palace to catch a horse. And Emeric Dane looked at Major Delphine Rook for the first and only time in that entire inquiry, took his eyes off the wall and put them on her, which is a thing I had not seen him do to any living person in 11 years, and he said, No, ma'am, I did not leave my post. Then what did you do, guardsman? I took it with me. The Board of Inquiry found, at 20 to 5 that afternoon, that Guardsman Emerick Dane had acted lawfully, proportionately, and in accordance with his standing orders, and that the force used against Mr. Waldo Fritt was necessary to preserve that gentleman's life, and it recommended that he be restored to public duties forthwith. It also recommended, and this is in the finding, and I have a copy of the finding, that the raw material in the possession of the Crown Aviation Office be laid before the police without delay. That took 4 days. It might have taken 4 months. It took 4 days because Ivo Bassett walked into a police station on the Friday morning with a memory card in his fist and a solicitor he could not afford, and put it on the counter and said, "I want to give a statement, and I want it recorded, and I want you to start with the audio at 11:41. He lost his job, which he expected, and his trade, which he did not. The one unforgivable sin in that world is not cruelty but disloyalty to the man who signs the invoices. He records birdsong now. He told me it is the first work he has ever had where nobody asks him to make a noise sound worse than it was. He still has my drawing. He keeps it where he can see it. The Crown against Dorian Prosk was heard at the Crown Court at Thornhall over 5 days in the summer, and I sat in the gallery for every hour of it with my book on my knee, and I did not draw one line. He had good lawyers. He had the best lawyers money can buy, and money bought a great many of them, and they fought the flight log and they lost, and they fought the audio and they lost, and on the 3rd morning they stopped fighting and started explaining, which is what lawyers do when the fighting is over. The charges, when the clerk read them, took some time. Operating an unmanned aircraft within the restricted airspace of the royal palaces, reckless endangerment of persons, being the crowd on the king's approach, reckless endangerment of the mounted escort of the royal household, assault by a thrown object, being one brass token, upon a sentry in the execution of his duty, attempting to breach the perimeter of a royal residence. And added late, after a long argument in the judge's chambers that I did not hear and would dearly love to have heard, perverting the course of justice, in that he did publish a film he knew to be a false account, with intent to defeat an investigation into his own conduct. The judge was Corwin Leask, 71 years old, with a face like a folded map. The prosecution's case was, from beginning to end, Dorian Prosk's own film. They played it in order. They played the first Tuesday, the mimicry, the wind-up bit, the crowd's laugh. They played the tokens. They played, and they played it 3 times at the jury's request, 9 frames of high-resolution footage, shot by Prosk's own ladder camera, of a brass disc leaving his hand overarm and flat and striking a man's cheekbone below the eye, and Ivo's sound went with it, and the courtroom heard what I had heard. A woman on the jury put her hand over her mouth. They played Friday. They played the drone's own view, his view, the one he had wanted, the beautiful one, the sweep down the line of horses in that hard spring light. And it is, God help us all, a magnificent piece of film, and it is the most damning thing I have ever seen, because it is shot from the exact position of the crime. You look down out of the sky at Kestrel's gray quarters coming up at you, and you understand in your stomach, with no expert to tell you, precisely what is about to happen and precisely who is making it happen. They played the audio, if a horse jumps were made. And then on the 4th day, the prosecution did something I did not see coming, and neither, from the look on his face, did Dorian Prosk. They played his 51-second film, all of it. The heartbeat soundtrack, the falling barrier, the white glove, the man going down, Prosk's wet eyes in the car at dusk. They played it in a silent courtroom for a jury that had, by then, spent 3 days watching what had actually happened, and they let it run to the end, and then they played it again beside the raw footage, side by side on 2 screens with the timecode running. It took 4 minutes. It was the most brutal thing I have ever watched done to a man in a public place, and nobody laid a finger on him, and every second of it was his own work. He gave evidence. Of course he did. He had never in his life met a room he did not believe he could win. He was fluent, and he was rueful, and he said more than once that he had made a terrible mistake, and that he had never intended harm to anybody, and that he had spent his whole career trying to show people that the powerful are only human. And the prosecuting counsel, a very tired-looking woman who had said almost nothing for 2 days, stood up and asked him 4 questions. "Mr. Prosk, when the barrier fell and people went into the road, what did you do?" "It was chaotic. I was trying to." "You flew a second pass. It is in your own flight log." "What did you do next?" "I lost control of the—" "When the machine came down, and there was a woman bleeding on the cobblestones 8 feet behind you, and a trooper on a rearing horse, and a broken column, and a princess of this realm standing in an open carriage counting the casualties, what did you do?" He did not answer. "You climbed the railings of the palace," she said, "and you shouted about your camera. Mr. Prosk, in 3 days at that gate, on your own 8 cameras, in 4 hours of your own audio, is there 1 second one in which you ask whether anybody is hurt?" He sat in that box with 11 million people behind him, and he could not find one. The jury was out for 2 hours and 40 minutes. They convicted on everything. Judge Leask sentenced him on a Friday morning in July, and I was there, and I wrote down what he said, and I am going to set it out because it is the only piece of writing in this whole account that is better than mine. "Mr. Prosk," he said, "you have been described in this court as a man who mocks. I do not think that is what you are. Mockery is careless, and there is nothing careless about you. You are a man who studies what other people hold sacred, in order to find out what it will cost them to keep hold of it, and then you charge admission. You went to the gate of this palace, and you found there a man whose entire duty is to stand still, and you understood at once that his stillness was the most valuable thing in that square, not to him. To you, because a stillness is only worth filming if it can be broken, and you set about breaking it with more patience, more intelligence, and more capital than most men bring to honest work. You did not succeed. I want the record to show that you did not succeed. Guardsman Dane did not give you your second of film. He gave it to nobody. He stood, and when he finally moved, he moved to a horse's head and not to your face, and had he done otherwise, had he taken 1 step toward you, which you had spent 3 days and a great deal of money inviting him to take, you would today be a wealthy man with a grievance instead of a convicted one, and he would be finished. That is how narrow it was. That is what his discipline was worth, and you should understand before you leave this room that the only thing standing between you and everything you wanted was a man on a stone doing his job. The sentence was 2 years, suspended for 4, and a fine so large that his lawyers had to ask for it to be read again. He was disqualified from operating any aircraft in this realm for life. He was excluded from the realm entirely for a term of 10 years. He was ordered to pay compensation to Mrs. Odalfray, who broke a knee at the barrier, and to Trooper Inez Calder, who did not want it and gave it away. The aerial camera unit, together with all its recordings, which he had so carefully, so formally, so expensively established were his exclusive property, was forfeit to the Crown. And the raw footage went into the public record, all of it. 4 hours of Tuesday and 4 hours of Friday, unedited, uncut, released as evidence, free to anyone who wanted it. He had spent 3 days and 11 million viewers trying to make the world look at Merrick Dane's face. The world looked. They did not see what he had promised them. They saw a man standing on a stone with a bruise on his cheekbone, while 400 people tried to buy a piece of him for 500 crowns. They saw 2 minutes and 40 seconds of a machine screaming at a man's eyes, and a man not moving. They saw 4 strides and a white glove and a horse's head coming down. The clip that went round the world in the end was 11 seconds long, and Dorian Prosk shot it, and it is the one from the latter camera where he is 9 feet away with his back turned and utterly at that man's mercy, and Guardsman Merrick Dane runs straight past him without a glance, because there was a horse. Somebody put a title on it. He never even looked at him. It has been watched more times than everything Dorian Prosk ever made, put together, and he does not receive a penny of it because the Crown owns the film, and the Crown gave the whole of the proceeds to the old company's fund. The fund's spring subscription was rescheduled for the last Saturday in July. I have drawn that street for 31 years, and I have never seen anything like it. They closed the King's Approach at 9 in the morning, and by 11 there was no room to stand. The escort came out at noon, 16 horses, breastplates going like water, and Kestrel was the near-side leader of the second file with Trooper Calder up. And when the gray mare came through the arch, the noise that went up off that stone was not a cheer. It was a roar, and it went on for a very long time. Princess Adela rode in the open carriage. She was not obliged to. She had been advised at some length not to. She got in and sat down and put her hands in her lap. At the north gate the column halted, and the guard presented arms, and she stood up in the carriage. She had a piece of paper, and she did not look at it once. 19 years I have taken this road, she said, and every year I have said something kind about our old soldiers, and every year the newspapers have printed it, and every year we have collected rather less than we needed. This year I am going to say something else. In the spring, a man came to that gate and spent 3 days and a great deal of money trying to prove that the man standing at it was not a person. He failed, and I want to tell you exactly how he failed, because the reason is important and it is not the reason people are giving. He did not fail because Guardsman Dane is hard. He failed because Guardsman Dane is asterisk not asterisk hard, and never was, and stood there anyway. I have been told, several times, and by people who ought to know better, that a guardsman left his post that day. He did not. He carried it 40 feet into a road full of people and put it between them and 600 kilos of frightened horse, and then he brought it back and stood in it for another 2 hours with a bruise on his face, and was suspended for 11 days and said nothing. That is what the post asterisk is. The stone is not the post. The man is the post. And she turned, and she looked at the left-hand sentry box, and she inclined her head to him, as she had every spring for 19 years, and the King's Guard presented arms. They collected that afternoon rather more than they needed. There is one more thing, and then I am finished. When the sweepers came to clear the King's Approach after Friday in the spring, the bad Friday, the horses, the barrier, they found the tokens, hundreds of them. Brass, a lion with its tongue out, Prosk, take the shot, all down the gutters and the cobbles and under the railings where they had been thrown at a man's boots and a man's face. The crowd got there first. I watched them do it and did not understand what I was seeing for some minutes. People on their hands and knees on the cobbles, in ones and twos and then in dozens, gathering up brass coins, and I thought, in the ugly mood I was in that week, that they were taking souvenirs. They were carrying them to the iron collection box on the wall of the north gate, the old company's fund. It has been screwed to that wall since before my father was born, and most days it takes about 11 crowns. They filled it. They filled it so full that the sergeant of the guard had to send for the key and empty it twice, and when the box could take no more, they stacked the tokens on the ledge beneath it in little brass towers, and an old woman I had never seen before stood there for an hour making sure nobody took one back. It was, as money, worth almost nothing. Brass, novelty tokens. The fund had them weighed and the whole hoard came to some 400 crowns. The fund did not spend them. They were melted, all of them that autumn, and cast into a single disc the size of a saucer, and set flat into the cobbles of the King's Approach, 8 feet from the left-hand sentry box, on the exact spot where a man stood for 3 days and did not move. There is nothing written on it. That argument was won by Sergeant Major Osric Hale, who said that if you put words on it the tourists would read the words and go away, and that if you left it blank they would have to ask. It is a plain brass circle in the stone, polished by the boots of 11,000 people a day, and it is the brightest thing on that street. He came back to the gate in August. I was at my pitch, third stone from the lamp post, the one the rain finds first, and I saw the relief come up under the arch, and I saw the bearskins, and I counted them the way I have counted them for 31 years, and there he was on the left-hand box, and the bruise was gone, and he stood the way he has always stood, looking at nothing, at a point above the heads of the crowd. The crowd was enormous that month. They come now in a way they never did. And the strange thing, the thing I did not expect and still cannot entirely account for, is that they are quiet. They stand at the railings and they look at him, and they do not shout, and they do not wave their arms, and they do not, ever, throw anything. Now and then somebody small one gets excited and is hushed, gently, by a stranger. 2 weeks later, on a Thursday evening, when the light was going and I was packing my boards, a man in a plain gray coat stopped at my pitch. He looked at the easel for a while. I had them all out, the gate, the arch, the snow, the horses. "Mr. Wren." "Guardsman." He did not say anything about the inquiry, or the court, or the token I had picked up off the cobbles and carried to a table under a portrait of a dead king. He never has, and I do not expect him to, and I would think less of him if he did. He put 4 crowns on the corner of my stool. "The one with the gray mare," he said. I looked at him. It was the sketch from that Friday, done afterwards, from memory, in the hour when my hands came back, and it has Kestrel in it with her head coming down and her nose against a red tunic, and Trooper Calder white-faced above her, and the broken column behind, and it is, I think, the best thing I have ever drawn. There is a man in it holding the rein, but he is turned away and you cannot see his face, and I had drawn him like that on purpose and had never been able to say why. "You're not in it," I said, "not so as anyone would know you." "No," said Americ Dane. "That's why I wanted." He took the drawing, and he thanked me, and he walked off down the King's Approach in the last of the light, an ordinary man in an ordinary coat, entirely unrecognized by the several hundred people who had come from the other side of the world to look at him. He stepped over the brass disc without looking down. I picked up my pencil and I turned to a clean page, and I put the date at the top, and I began to draw the railings. Iron is honest, it does not fidget. But I will tell you what I know, after 31 years of drawing men who are not permitted to move. And it took a rich man with a flying camera and 11 million friends to teach it to me properly. The stillness is not the man being empty. The stillness is the man holding. And there is no camera on this earth that can film the difference, which is why they keep coming, and why they keep trying, and why they will never, ever get it.